Hello viewers at home, good evening, it's good to see you all here. We've been talking about this for a few days now, talking about perspectives about insecurity in Nigeria. That's why we're here, and we've lined up a few speakers for you tonight. I'll give you a few things about what we're going to talk about. Nigeria is a nation of about 200 million citizens in it. The nation got her independence on October 1st, 1960, pardon me. And the British, and since then we have gone through various challenges, just like every other nation, in terms of economy, security, etc. But the main concern for tonight is about the insecurity of the nation. Year in, year out, the rate of insecurity in Nigeria has continued to rise, from incessant killings to kidnappings, from Boko Haram, from the herdsmen clashes, etc. And this seems to have no end. And one of the things that have actually precipitated or led to this is there is a major lack of confidence between Nigerians, so on the minds of Nigerians, regarding the system and the attitude, perceived attitude of the government regarding this. People are being killed in large numbers, kidnapping becoming a business, and lots of Nigerians are feeling the pain. Even Nigerians, both within and outside the country, are feeling the pains. We've lined up some good speakers who are going to be talking to us tonight, giving us their perspectives about these issues. And I have here tonight, to my extreme right, I'm going to start with Sam Ughelli Oboh. Sam is a Nigerian-born Canadian architect. He's a manager, a leader, and the 2015 president of the Royal Architectural Institute of Canada. Sam is also the first Canadian to be elected as a president of the Alberta chapter of the Royal Architectural Institute of Canada in 2007. And in 2015, Alberta Venture named him as one of the top 50 most influential people in Alberta. In 2016, he assumed a diplomatic role in Canada as the honorary consul for the Republic of Botswana in Canada. Thank you so much, Sam. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
And next to Sam here is my very good friend, and that is Dr. Tope Oriola. Dr. Oriola is an associate professor of sociology at the University of Alberta. He's an author and the joint editor-in-chief of African Security Journal. His research is transnational in scope and has three main foci, which is in resource conflicts and concomitant government crimes. The second one is on the use of force and weaponization of the police, and the third is on terrorism studies. He regularly contributes to public scholarship through public talks, op-eds, media interviews, and expert opinions. Dr. Oriola, good to see you here.
Thank you very much.
And to my left, I have here with me, she's a music director. She's no stranger to the house. That is Dr. Ajoke. She's a GIS, Geospatial data scientist. She's a researcher at the University of Alberta, and she's a partner at Jolexi Environmental Services. She's an avid drummer. I want you to note that. She's a music director and a church music consultant. Ajoke regularly contributes to social media and community issues through various social media platforms. Ajoke, good to see you here.
My pleasure.
All right. And we're going to be talking about our last guest tonight, and that's going to be Honorable Francis Waive. I'm going to be talking about him in a moment, but we can go ahead and start from this. How did we get here, Dr. Oriola, if I may ask you?
Well, I think the clouds had been gathering for a while. You have to go to the last 30 to 40 years to have an understanding of the current state of affairs. Now, with, of course, successive civilian and military administrations, the failure to craft an all-encompassing vision for the country, and the pervasive failure of leadership at different levels, all of this have coalesced into what we currently find. So on one hand, you have an ongoing crisis of leadership, economic problems as well, which have led to lateral or horizontal violence, things like interpersonal forms of violence among citizens, where an individual, for instance, might be set alight because they've stolen a cell phone. And then you realize that that reaction goes beyond the object that was stolen. The object is a mere symbol of anger, and that's immanent in the people. We can also talk about political violence, violence sponsored by elites as a way of winning elections. That goes way back in Nigeria's socio-political history. As recently as June 2019, then outgoing governor of Ogun State, Ibikunle Amosun, handed over 1,000 pieces of AK-47s and about 4 million rounds of ammunition to the police shortly after the elections. And then, of course, that begs the question, how did he acquire these weapons in a state where federating units didn't have any control over law enforcement agencies? So how did a governor, at the twilight of his administration, have access to such weapons? And so political leaders, political elites have played a role in the arming of insurgents, for instance, in the Niger Delta region. That's a fairly established issue in the literature. We could also talk about violence perpetrated by state forces. Violence of the military, for instance, against the Islamic movement of Nigeria, IMN, or the Shiites, as they're popularly known. Violence against IPOV members or MASOB members, those advocating for a sovereign state of Biafra. All of these issues have contributed to heating up the polity. So clearly state forces have played a role in that. We could also talk about violence that's been used as a way of making claims, political claims on the Nigerian state. And in particular, violence in the Niger Delta region, where people are deploying violence, kidnapping oil workers, for instance, blowing up pipelines, engaging in illegal oil bunkering, as a way of making political demands on the Nigerian state. So it is a perfect storm when the making of the current state of affairs in Nigeria is a multidimensional one.
Wow. Sam, you just came from Nigeria. Tell us your experience.
Yeah, well, I've been in Nigeria a few times, right. But first and foremost, a disclaimer: I am not an expert in Nigerian affairs, okay. So I'm just offering perspective, and I hope that is going to be valuable perspective. I totally agree with Dr. Oriola on all the things he had mentioned, and there's definitely a lot of things to learn from Nigeria. But I try to bring it down to something very, very simple, right? That whatever you see in any community is an abstraction of the value of that community. Okay. I think there's something that is very amazing about, being a Nigerian, that we tend to romanticize about our culture, right? I always believe that culture is a package, okay? You don't select which aspect of your culture, that you tend to talk about, and you ignore other aspects of your culture that you practice, but you don't want to talk about it to define you. And culture is also something that is very dynamic. So the culture of our people in 1914 during the amalgamation in Nigeria is definitely not the culture that exists right now, even though we tend to think that we have the same culture that is static. So when you look at culture from that point of view, of that dynamic, aspect, then you tend to start, seeing, some kind of trends, that we need to start questioning, right? That gets into that area of identity. Who are we as a people? Do we really know who we are as a people? And what defines that? And then you can bring it down to that very single unit, the family unit. I mean, when, we were, quite young, one of the messages that we always get is always remember which family you're from. Right. Or always remember where you're from, right? The last thing my dad told me when I was going to the university at the age of 16 was, remember which home you're from, right? Those values, you tend to question right now. If we say that that's our culture, are those values really what we see now in Nigeria? And I think we'll kind of explore that further, right, to go into some level of details into, the whole dynamics of leadership, followership, and the kind of things we do. I believe that Nigeria as a country is a system. There's a whole lot of things that we need to question. We need to question things that people are not comfortable questioning. We need to question the very basis of Nigeria's population as 200 million. Where's the proof that Nigeria's population is 200 million? Right? I'm not that I have any better data, than that. But I always tell my friends, when I go to Lagos, for instance, there's always this, aspect where they say, oh, Lagos is actually, 20 million, 21 million. And I said, you know what? I can question that, can't I? The reason why I'm bringing that up is just one aspect of our culture and one aspect of our values that that is intertwined into the political system that we have. Any system that you have that has an incentive for you to lie about certain things, right, then we should question it, right? Kano State having 44 local government or Lagos State having so many local government are all product of political, calculations that are tied to revenue distribution formula.
Right.
So the higher the number of your population is, the more money you get from the center, from the federal government. So there's already an incentive to hyperinflate.
Right.
I am not saying that's what it is. I have no evidence to prove that is what it is. We'll go by all the numbers that United Nations, has provided. But I'm just saying, can we, as a people, are we even bold to even ask that demographic question so that we can start addressing all the problems that Dr. Oriola was talking about? We need to know who we are, where we are, who is what's the demographic composition, and all that. But the questions we ask about our demographic, the demographic questions we ask right now, they are totally irrelevant. Every form that we fill out in Nigeria right now, the first thing they ask you, what's your state of origin? What's your local government of origin?
Right.
What's your religion? Are you married? Those are interesting questions, but those are not interesting questions that I want to see when I'm applying for a university application. You should ask me, where's my place of residence?
That's right.
If I live in Yola, I pay my taxes in Yola, I do everything in Yola, why should I be discriminated, right, that I'm not an indigent? And I think those are some of the things that fuel, right, the crisis, that we do have, in the... Anyway, I'll leave it there for you to think about. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sam. Let's quickly talk. Ajoke, what do you think? You seem to be somebody that's very passionate about the values of Nigerians. How does values relate to what the nation is currently going through, especially with regards to security?
I think the values of a people determine what outcomes they get as a people. We tend to want to separate our values from our outcomes in Nigeria. Building up from what he said, I know that in Canada we have at least 2 censuses done every decade.
Right.
And you have that done both on the federal level and at the provincial level. The last census in Nigeria was, I think, 10 years ago or thereabout. So first of all, we don't even know who is Nigerian and who has come in since we last counted each other.
Right.
Another thing I would like to say is we have one of the most porous borders in the world, yet it's such a very big one if you compare it to other West African countries. Those borders are left unmanned, or even when you have people who man them, the selfish interest comes in first, where people just want to make money from what goes on at the borders without thinking of the implications on every other person on the inside. I also want to speak about climate change, which is often overlooked.
Right.
So you hear people say, oh, it's the Fulanis, it's the Hausas. But if you go around the Sahel in Africa, some of these challenges are not unique to Nigeria. But every other country has looked at how to curb this in a very realistic way. Like the average Fulani person has been raised to believe that, like the old Israelites, wherever your foot shall step on, you shall possess. And on the other side, my own farmland is mine. My father gave it to me.
Okay, Ajoke, sorry to cut in. I know this is a subject you're so passionate about. And yeah, we're going to go shortly into that. So let's say you're going to go shortly into the aspect of the herdsmen clashes. Ladies and gentlemen, I quickly want to introduce to you tonight. We have Right Honorable Reverend Francis Ejirogene Waive. He is a House of Representatives member representing Ughelli North, Ughelli South, Udu Federal Constituency. He's a clergyman by calling. He's an accountant by profession. He's also an author, a rural demography expert, a newspaper columnist, and a radio and TV evangelist. Honorable, it's an honor to have you here tonight.
It's my pleasure.
Thank you so much. So yeah, we've just been talking about how we got here as a nation, and I would really like to now go into the aspect of security, which is why we are here. What is the government really doing enough to ensure safety for Nigerians?
The government. I think security is everybody's business. To leave it in the hands of government alone will not be good for anyone. Here in the Western world, 911, everybody makes a call, everybody contributes. You see something, you say something. But it will appear like in Nigeria, we want to say government, government, government. And government alone cannot do it. The government have done a little bit, and there's always room for improvement. But to say that government has done nothing is not true. To say that government can do more, yes. That's the way I would react.
Okay. Okay. So if I may ask this way, Dr. Oriola, lately there's been a lot of noise regarding the herdsmen clashes, kidnappings, and loss of lives. And I've read a few of your articles, opinion on Premium Times. I still read something you wrote, I think, a few days ago. And one of the things I would like to ask you is, who are these killers? Who are these kidnappers? For some time, it's been perceived to be a certain set of people in Nigeria. It's been associated to certain tribes, but is that really true?
Well, if I could preface my comment by just jumping on what the Honorable has just said, I think that, yes, the government is making some efforts, as you rightly said. But I think that in any society, the state is the signifier. The state has to take the forefront. The state has to be at the vanguard of efforts to secure places of their jurisdiction. Now, a failure to do that is a direct call for vigilantism. And what is going on in South Africa, for instance, is one example of that, where citizens were testing the boundaries, beating up a few Nigerians here and there, killing a few every now and then, 2016, 2017, and then what has been happening the last few days. Right. Now, the South African state obviously has a much more organic reach than the Nigerian state. When you look at the failed state index, for instance, which is a globally recognized index, Nigeria comes closer to many of its parameters than South Africa does. But on that one count, because of the failure to act swiftly and decisively by the government of South Africa, and the pronouncements of a few members of the ruling party, the African National Congress, that was read as a sort of call, a dog whistle kind of call for citizens to take the laws into their own hands. So I've used that example just to sort of demonstrate that even in climes that are better policed, where you have greater levels of law enforcement, when the leadership fails to send a very strong message, you're indirectly asking people to engage in vigilantism. And mob action could be the consequence. And that's what we found today in South Africa. Now, to link that directly back to your question, now, there is the ECOWAS protocol on freedom of movement of goods and humans and so forth. Nigeria is a signatory to that. And therefore, there is an element of truth to some of the claims at the highest levels of government that not all of those perpetrators are Nigerians. The Fulanese, as we all know, are a nomadic group spread across Africa. They have similar but not identical issues in Ghana as we speak. There are people studying this same phenomenon in Ghana. Okay. I met one of such persons in Piduasi as recently as June of this year. So the herder-farmer issue is a huge problem. And as our sister said earlier, the climate crisis has contributed to these issues. So the drying up of rivers, the reduction in the pasture that's available, that has led to a situation where more and more of these herders are pushing southwards, much more than before. But having said that, there is an explicit criminal element that has crept in. Now, the idea that in the 21st century, a group of young men or multiple groups of young men could be reasonably expected to simply follow cattle all over the bushes is irrational. This ought to have been dealt with. Now, these are individuals on whom we have made zero human capital investment. Now, and so those we have failed to train, as I wrote in one of those articles, are the ones who are engaging in these kidnappings. Now, yes, there are some of these kidnappers who are of the Fulani stock within the Nigerian society. And yes, there are some others who come from outside Nigeria and also happen to be Fulani. But it is also the reality that several young men, and they're predominantly men, within southern Nigeria have also gotten on the bandwagon because there have been no serious consequences to these kidnappings. Okay. So these are opportunistic crimes, and people can see that it's easy to make this money, and therefore they can target individuals, in some cases that they know, in other cases individuals they don't know. So we've actually gone from this Colombian-style kind of kidnappings where you kidnap people randomly and so forth. There have been reported cases where family members of relatively wealthy individuals who arrange for the kidnappings of their own relatives in order to make money. Right. Another dimension in the last few months has been self-kidnapping. Yeah. My favorite example on that would be a clergyman, apologies, Reverend, in Ekiti State, who arranged his own kidnapping in order to make money from his church and the members. Wow. So again, the economic incentive is there again, and it's an emotional thing. People know that there are certain individuals close to them who are emotionally connected to them. When you tell others around them that, oh, this person has been kidnapped, they will be compelled to bring out money. Some children have, in fact, arranged their own kidnappings in order to get money from their parents. There was a 14-year-old girl who went to see her boyfriend somewhere in the southeast and said that she had been kidnapped. Wow. But these are all symptoms of a much deeper problem. So that when they say somebody has HIV/AIDS, you don't complain that the person is losing weight. Well, it's part of the territory. It's part of this. Yeah, that's right. But there's a much deeper thing going on. So to answer this and sum this briefly, we have failed as a society in the last 30 to 40 years to train a huge number of people. As we speak, there are at least 14 million out-of-school children in Nigeria. Now, they are not yet part of the criminal class we're talking about, but they are potential recruits for that group. I was in Maiduguri as recently as July of this year. I was there twice. Part of those I interviewed were women who were either kidnapped or donated by their husbands or family members to Boko Haram to serve as suicide bombers, but chose not to detonate their bombs. And I don't know if the military authorities are watching, but I'm grateful to the Chief of Army Staff for granting us access to those high-value individuals. Now, in a society where you do not place premium on human life, you're asking for these kinds of conditions. Right. And I think at this juncture, it's absolutely critical that we recognize that nobody is safe anymore, not even the rich, as is becoming increasingly clear, because there is such grievance, there is such animosity in the system that people are willing and able to just lash out at the rest of society. And so the problem that we have right now is not a mere Fulani problem. I can understand the sentiment. I can understand why people like to put a name to. When you put a name or a face to a crisis in the mind's eye of members of society, it seems like the problem is already solved. But in reality, our problems go way deeper than that. And we've got to recognize that as long as we have millions of our citizens, regardless of what part of the country they come from, who are out of school, or have never been tutored. I interviewed just in July 17, 14, 18-year-olds who had never been to school in their lives, ever, not even a day at school. Because that's the world that they know. And the idea that they see all of these good things of life, their pertinences and paraphernalia of the 21st century around them, well, they want to share in that. And that's part of the sources of insecurity in Nigeria.
Thank you so much. Dr. Ajoke, if I may ask you, what do you think are the root causes of this?
Well, I think I'll build off what Dr. Oriola said. In addition to people not being educated at all, I think generally education has been very poor, even when people find themselves in within the four confines of a university.
Right.
So I know Kenya put in a nomadic education policy in place for nomadic farmers and herders.
Right.
I don't know what nomadic thing Nigeria has in place. Yes, we created a few schools for the Almajiris, but how do you then ensure that the cattle rearer who just strolled into town with his own mindset and everything doesn't come in to disrupt what is on ground?
Yeah, but lately the government had spoken about Ruga, and as a way to probably contain that. Do you think that can work?
I believe Ruga will work when every Nigerian gets desensitized to the need for violence to start with. So that's where education comes in. And when I mean education, I mean in every language, even if it means the 250 or more that we have. Because right now there's this mistrust that anything that comes from the north is against the people who are in the south, and anything that starts off from the south is against the people in the north, which is not always the case. I think we've grown to the point where most Nigerians don't even trust the government for anything at all. So even when the Ruga thing came up, I shared a video on Facebook where a professor was saying, it's not really new.
Yes, that's right.
We were doing this in the past, but because of all these other things and other things that have built on them, you know, like sometimes you have random people also showing up in communities and starting up violence for monetary reasons. That's another issue. That one would be some other time. I don't think we'd have time to talk about that today. So we need to get to a point where we trust our government enough to believe in policies that come in. That's where I believe the local press comes in as well. Right. In addition to all the other vices, I think the press in Nigeria has become so monetized that they don't do enough to be fair in reporting. Right. So you hear that somebody was kidnapped. What they say is suspected Fulani headsmen kidnap Christian pastor from the south. Right. What about the man from Zamfara or Kano who has been kidnapped as well? Who's lost his cattle to, what are they called now? Rustlers. The whole communities that have been sacked. They are not Southerners and they are not Christians, but they are also victims of these vices we're talking about. And it has also been confirmed in the last few weeks that some of these kidnappings in the north have southern elements as well. Like the arms supplier to the candidate who was caught in, was it Tarama or, yeah, at Wadume, was actually a southerner. So it's actually a one Nigeria thing when it comes to crime in Nigeria, irrespective of where it happens. So we must first try and educate people. You know, this is not meant to take away what you have. Men of God as well. I'm sorry, sir, but I have to say this. Yeah, so let me just say that I am a Christian and I have been for decades. But we need to start talking to each other. Right. A bishop recently went on the altar and was talking about how they were cursing every Fulani headsman out there. Yeah. You know, so, and he has such a wide followership around the world. All he needs to do is to stand up there and say, this president is blah, 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 blah. They have an agenda against the people. That's all it takes. Nobody else wants to get schooled or educated on what exactly this policy is. Nobody wants to sit down to read.
So can we go back to, you know, some of the basics, right? To kind of unpack certain things before even going into some of the, you know, possible solutions of Ruga and the rest. Yeah. From my own perspective, based on my upbringing, I think I always tease my friends that if there's anyone that is very Nigerian, I think I qualify to be the most Nigerian, right? You know, ever. So born in Lagos, did my primary school in Maiduguri, you know, Yola, went to Eboma, you know, in Benin, right? You know, did my first degree, moved to Zaria, served in Katsina, right? You know, you know, stayed in Port Harcourt and all that. Now, that's over a period of time. And throughout that, I learned something. One of the things I learned is Nigerians are the same, but the manifestation is different. Yeah. They are the same. The yearning is the same. And when there's that perception of inequality, I've never believed that Nigeria's problem, right, is the tribe or the religion that we always gravitate to, even though that's the bane of our problem right now.
Right.
Those are actually distractions. Nigeria's problem right now, to me, seems like a problem of class and values.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right? Problem of class and values, right? When I was in school, I mean, we were in school together. I think I would qualify as an indigent student when I was a student, as far as I know, right? As an indigent student, you have to be very calculative of where you get your school fees from, what you do, and all that. And during that time, Abel Ubeku used to be one of the most prominent, person from my part of the country where my parents are from, right? Isoko, who is an Isoko man. And I always toyed with the idea that if I should walk up to Abel Ubeku right now, that I do not have money to pay for my school fees, what are the chances that Abel Ubeku will give me money immediately, not knowing me from anywhere, and say, hey, go pay your school fees? Versus, Abel Ubeku being very close to Yaradua at that time. If Yaradua's son had gone to Abel Ubeku without Yaradua's son asking any question, hey, take 5,000 naira, right. At that time, I'm talking about 5,000 naira then. I'm not talking about what 5,000 naira is right now. Take 5,000 naira, for your transport, and all that. That's a likely occurrence, than Ubeku, right? I'm sorry I'm mentioning Ubeku, but for me, he was the most prominent. He was the manager of Guinness, and he was an inspiration to a lot of us, right? And all that. That does not mean, of course, I didn't try to go to Ubeku, right? So I'm sure if I had tried, he's a great guy. I've heard a lot of good things about him. But the point I'm trying to bring out is, Yaradua from Katsina versus Ubeku from Delta State, right, have something in common than me, right, and Ubeku at that time because of, the class difference, right? The poor man in Katsina and the poor man in Delta State has something in common. However, our elites have actually been able to exploit, some of the other differences, right? Differences in, religion and value to galvanize people to distract. So I would like us to really unpack some of those basic things that we thought went wrong. Nigeria is in the 60s, Nigeria in the 70s is not the Nigeria of today, right? There are certain values. There are times that a Nigerian would rather die than to take a bribe in Nigeria. I saw it in my lifetime. A Nigerian would rather, no, good name is better than anything.
That's right.
Right? So can we go to some of those values and some of the things that are actually encouraging that? I did mention earlier on the whole idea of state of origin, local government of origin, which frankly speaking makes absolutely no sense. Personally, I remember when I was in Yola, in my secondary school, I used to pay school fees of 40 naira. That was a lot of money. 40 naira was the school fees. The indigents were paying 0, and they were getting bursary, on top. They were getting money, and I was paying 40 naira. And that was because I'm from what they call educationally advantaged state, right? And there are people that are from educationally disadvantaged state. Now, that's a different conversation. I think that's a disservice to people that are categorized that way, whether you are from an advantaged state or a disadvantaged state. Because while I was in my class, one of the smartest mathematicians in my class, Salih Ibrahim, gave me a run for my money. It kind of challenges this whole stereotype that when you're from the South, you're better off. We have the likes of Jibril Aminu, who actually excelled in places like University of Ibadan. We have a common friend, here, who is a professor here at the University of Alberta, Professor Aminu, right? Professor of medicine, right? Who from University of Sokoto went to University of Ibadan. I mean, he excelled and broke, so the whole stereotype that we push in Nigeria, right, shows that we know little. It kind of reminds me of the whole tools that apartheid used, right, to colonize, the people. If I know less about Dr. Oriola, the more likelihood that I can be used as a weapon to really attack him because I know nothing about him, right? I think that's some of the things that I'll leave it there, if we can kind of unpack, some of those aspects, because if we can get to some of those roots and kind of, break it down, unpack some of those things, perhaps that will shed some light into some of the things that are happening, right now. And then we can start talking about the symptoms, which, can be addressed easily.
So, Honorable Waive, if I may ask, what role did corruption play in this?
In the matter of
insecurity.
Insecurity. Well, there's nothing in our country.
Oh, sorry. Sorry. If I may ask, before even going into the government, is an average Nigerian corrupt?
That's a tough question to answer because you will now need to measure average.
Okay.
You will now need to measure average.
That's right.
What is the average when you talk about Nigeria? If you're going to use the population and then count those who are corrupt, then you say the average Nigerian is not. Because I believe that of the over 200 billion Nigerians, many are very honest, very hardworking, people with good values.
Right.
But that fraction of our population that's into criminality appear to be more visible, maybe because they have the access to government coffers, access to opportunities for criminality. So if you want to take the average from that sect of persons who have this access, then you might say more than average are corrupt. Right. But if you take generality of population, Nigerians are some of the best, some of the most noble people in the world. I've traveled a little bit, and I was talking with somebody a short while ago, and he was saying to me that if there's a reincarnation, you want to be a Nigerian again. Sure. And that's the kind of people we have as a country, people who are proud of their heritage. They know that nobody became a Nigerian by choice. I don't know of any, perhaps some people nationalized, but for many of us, that's where we're born. We didn't choose it. And my theology believes that God does not make any mistakes.
That's right.
And if he made me a Nigerian, he has a purpose. And I have a duty to pursue that purpose. And that's to make my country better for myself and everybody that lives there. Nigerians are good people. Majority of Nigerians are honest people. Majority of Nigerians are hardworking. Perhaps some of the most hardworking people in the world are Nigerians. Some of the most intelligent people in the world are Nigerians. We earn our living. We earn our pride of place in the Committee of Nations. And I think somebody was asking me, why didn't you use the diplomatic passport or something? I said, this green shows I'm Nigerian and I'm proud of it. and there are many of us who are like that. Although you faced a few hurdles because of the perception. But I think that we have a calling to change that. Right. Some people have messed it up. Some of us have a calling to change it. And I'm sure we're going to change it. I'm sure.
Thank you so much.
I wanted to quickly say something about, when we talk of corruption in Nigeria, it's not just about those who have access to government coffers. I think there is a general corrupt mindset that many don't even realize is corruption. Somebody brings money and gives you 10,000. He works in the government office and earns 15,000. And he's able to give you 10,000 without even thinking about it. Obviously, he's corrupt. He's stealing. You don't ask. You are corrupt as well. So I think when we speak of corruption in Nigeria, I don't just look at the government, because that's the people who are in government come from among us. Yeah. I worked in a university environment. I saw certain things that many people did not count as corruption. So I feel like in the bid to change our identity from a nation that is not corrupt, we must also be sincere by calling out some of those things. Like he mentioned, the values. So there is a general value in Nigeria right now of corruption across board, across government, across citizens, across religious institutions as well. So I define corruption as your lack of ability to hold others accountable, or your indifference towards how wealth is gotten or what people do, and our inability to reward hard work as a people.
Yeah, I agree with you to the extent that that aspect is corruption.
Sorry, Honorable Waive. Yeah. I just quickly need to let the viewers know that you can be sending your questions in, and I will be willing to share them with the panel to answer. So you can go ahead, sir.
Yeah, that fraction that have access to those in power, even if you add them, that fraction that have access to those with government offices who collect such monies you are talking about, if you add them to the number of people who have those offices, it's still an insignificant fraction, percentage of our population. That's the point I'm making. Otherwise, our people are good people. We are naturally good people. Those who are corrupt and those who tolerate corruption, they are all corrupt. You talk about people who we report the negatives. I'll tell you something that happened in my own environment. You won't find this in the press, and there are a lot of such things Nigerians are involved in. Some years ago, yes,
how would dig it out?
Some years ago, somebody wanted to do Thanksgiving in our church. He had just been appointed into government office, and I've never met him before in my life. And I said, "Oh, I don't think there's any need for you to do this. You've been given the appointment, man. Just continue doing your job." He said, "No, he's going to bring the governor here. He's going to bring that, bring that." I said, "You don't need it. You are not a member of our church. We don't know you. We don't know your antecedents. We don't know your background. We don't." And he went financial. "Oh, this Thanksgiving service will bring at least X million to your church. The governor will be." And I'm like, "And so what? Please perish with your money. Your money perish with you." You won't see that in the press. The Sunday he fixed, there was another church that welcomed him, and they made that money. But nobody reported that I rejected that. But you know, when I began to run for election, and that same man came up and said, "I trust this man. He was able to reject something so and so time. I think he will be a good candidate, a good representative for us." So I got support from such people. There are a lot of such unreported cases among Nigerians. I will continue to be on the positive side. I know that we have challenges, and the challenges are enormous, and I know that we can work at them. One reason why I accepted to come to this discussion is because I'm also looking for solutions.
Right.
And I think that a meeting like this, we can find solutions. I'm not going to run away from the problem. I don't want us to run away from the problem. We must confront it. We must look for solutions. And we will find the solutions. And the solutions will not come from non-Nigerians. No. The solutions will come from us who are Nigerians. It's our country. We have no other country. And for me, I'm running nowhere. I'm going to stay there. Yeah, people ask me on this trip, "Oh, insecurity, how do you manage?" For me, we'll be there, and why would we analyze each of these incidences of insecurity and find out what's the problem, what's the possible solution. That's why many times on the floor of the House, I have spoken on possible solutions to the insecurity challenges.
Sorry, Honorable, if I may interrupt you there. Do you think some of these things are probably exaggerated?
I won't prefer the word exaggeration. I'll rather use the word, which word would be good? The reports are rather, the emphasis is on the negative.
Okay.
The stories over-reporting of the negative.
Okay.
But it's because the stories are true. But it's just that it's disproportionate. Look at what happened in New York the other day I read about. They said there was power failure for a few minutes somewhere. I don't live in North America, so you people know better. And within the period, there was a lot of illegal activity going on until power was restored. And I looked at that and I said to myself, there are criminals in New York.
Oh, yes.
It's just because the policing is serious. There's rule of law, so people maintain. Yeah. But you won't see that over-reported by the New York Times. True. Neither will you see the CNN flashing that again and again. But if that happened in Lagos, I tell you, all our media will have it on the front page again and again. Yeah. So there's that over-reporting.
But it also starts from, some of the things that we don't pay attention to. So I'll give a very, simple, example. I'm on, one of the WhatsApp platform for, my old school, right, back in Nigeria, and someone posted a joke, there that was really very interesting. And the joke was wedding, about marriage, wedding in the US, 100 invitations sent, 90 RSVP, 88 attended, the church service, and then 85 attended, the reception, and 0 thing missing. wedding in England,
right?
right? X number, invitation were sent out, X number accepted, 0 missing. Wedding in Nigeria, 500 invitations sent out, 1,000 people attended the church, 1,500 people to the wherever, and this is missing, this is missing, this is missing. Wow. So I said, this is interesting. First and foremost, I consider those kind of jokes as jokes that are, created by people that are intellectually lazy and without critical thinking, right? Because just the example you just gave about New York, right, is, the perception we all have about the United States, Canada, Switzerland, or wherever, a lot of those perceptions were shaped by the actions of the people and the government, collectively, right, to define the kind of values that are in that society. The United States, is also one of those countries that actually benefited from shaping their perception through the soft power they have, Hollywood. Mm-hmm. I will dare to say that Nigeria has actually benefited from that soft power with the power of Nollywood, because I still remember, 20 years ago, going to different parts of Africa, the hostility to you as a Nigerian has actually reduced significantly, because right now you go, you tell someone you're in Nigeria, they're cracking joke with you. Oh, I don't want wahala. I don't. Right. In fact, I was actually speaking to a very good friend, of mine in Ottawa, right? Who, was trying to mimic the whole Nigerian accent, which she got from the Nigerian movie, right? There's this whole addiction. So we cannot overemphasize the importance of those kind of things. However, with that said, that joke that was distributed in the platform, why I thought that that's the first step of dehumanizing us, right? And the first question I asked on the platform was, did this happen in your wedding? Because that didn't happen in my wedding. I had my wedding in Lagos. Right? I was there. I didn't see that happen. At my wedding. That didn't happen in my wedding. So is it okay for me to assume that since it didn't happen in my wedding, that's actually the norm in Nigeria? Because if it happened, I'm not saying it didn't happen, but you can't use this to define Nigeria. And what you're doing is you're dehumanizing, the country, and you're projecting, and you all are laughing about it, but you're actually projecting a very wrong image about it, because it's through the jokes that we tell about ourselves we know the truth. And part of it, the whole stereotype that is being projected in Nigeria comes through jokes, right? I've seen where, people joke about, there was an accident there and there were 2 people and 5 malams, right?
Right.
Things like that. Or, in the north, and say, they say, Mutanibio, meaning 2 people died and 5 in Yamiri, right? And all that. Now, those are the elements that we need to actually eradicate. Right? That's where it starts from. Because if I believe that you're an Inyamiri, or if I believe that you're an Ofe Manu, right? Or you are, whatever derogatory word, which, by the way, is not unique to Nigeria. It's also the issue in Southern Africa. Living in Southern Africa, I'm always a kwere kwere. Kwere kwere is a derogatory term that you use in defining foreigners. That's why the xenophobia that you see right now, it's an attack on the kwere-kweres, right, that you see. So all I'm trying to say is that soft aspect that we don't pay attention, and this is where orientation comes in. This is where awareness, that level of awareness to enlighten. I do not for one reason believe that your ability to read or write means you are literate, right? Yeah. If you use that as the basis of literacy, then the northern part of Nigeria is the most literate part of Nigeria, right? Why? Because virtually the rate at which people can read and write in Arabic, right, based on, the schooling, is actually very high. The rate at which people listen to Voice of America, BBC, Hausa Service, and all that, they're very aware, right? So I'm just trying to, take away that stereotype from southern part of Nigeria that believes that, they're very literate, they're very educated. I'm a product of a northern, system, right? Anyway, thank you.
Sorry to cut in there. I think it's high time we started talking about the solutions. The questions are already coming in. And one of those out there just says here, could the panelists please provide practical solutions as to how corruption can be mitigated?
If I may come in, I think this has to start at the highest levels of government. I said something earlier in passing, and that is that the state is the signifier. the members of society, citizens take cues from their leaders.
Right.
And of course, it's the chicken and egg argument around, governments and the way that they reflect the people and vice versa. Do we have the kind of government we have because that's who we are, or does who we are reflect on the leadership and so on and so forth. At the moment, we have a federal cabinet that includes the former governor of Bayelsa, Timi Silva,
Right.
and a senior advocate of Nigeria, whom you went to school with, Festus Keyamo.
Yeah.
Well, Festus Keyamo once prosecuted Timi Silva for corruption. But those two individuals are serving in the same cabinet as we speak. I am sorry when you have such contradictory messages coming out from the highest echelons of government. You're telling people that, well, hard work really does not pay.
But the people also elected them, right?
The people elected them, but you have to. That's why I said there's that chicken and egg, sort of debate, in terms of, the way that the leadership reflects the followership, and the followership in the end also reflects on the leadership. So both are mutually reinforcing and synergistic. There is that back and forth between the two sides. Mm-hmm. But the point is, for a government that came into power as this, anti-corruption, crusader kind of perspective and all of that, to turn to that, where you have somebody who had dozens of properties seized from him, and then you fast forward 4 or 5 years later, he's in the federal cabinet and he's serving in the same ministry, interestingly. It couldn't be more ironic, as the former EFCC prosecutor who was leading the light, trying to ensure that he secured conviction. You cannot afford such mixed messages if you're serious about fighting corruption.
Right.
The symbolism of having such characters in your cabinet already sends the wrong signals to the rest of society, that they could get rich in whatever way and all will be well. Look at the case of Maina. There was a particular civil servant by the name Maina,
right.
who went into hiding at some point and was wanted for massive levels of corruption. That case has died a natural death. Nobody's talking about it. We're talking about billions of funds in relation to pensions of people in Nigeria.
So sorry, just because of our time, I'm going to interrupt you a bit. So let's talk about how this relates to, how would this solve the insecurity problem? How would corruption, how will I say it, the fight against corruption, how can that stop or prevent or limit the rate of insecurity in Nigeria?
Well, a significant proportion of issues relating to insecurity in Nigeria concern basic economic crimes.
Okay.
Armed robbery, for instance, even kidnappings for the greater part, because demands are being made for money rather than political demands, for instance. And so, as long as we're able to fight corruption to the level where people are not taking the money that is meant for roads, for schools, for hospitals, and those kinds of things, they're not disappearing with them, then we do stand a chance to curb some of these problems. Now, in some cases, individuals who are engaged in criminality are not necessarily seeking a luxurious lifestyle. Some do, but most don't. They just want to survive.
Right.
These are crimes of opportunity, or lack thereof. And so, if we continue to allow corruption to thrive, that is a direct contributor to the insecurity in the system, because it means that a chunk of the Commonwealth is going into private pockets. It is going into paying the school fees of their children overseas. I've taught a few of those in this country, whose parents have multiple children. And then you wonder, how does this civil servant, how does this NEPA staff get to have 3-4 children in the top 100, and they're paying international fees, 15,000 plus per child, and in some cases are able to buy homes for their children in this part of the world. Wow. So, but again, if there's anything the last few months have taught us, it is that these kids that we are neglecting, the children of those that we're neglecting will hold those that we train to account. And then we're seeing that already.
That's right. Dr. Ajoke, if I may go to you, you seem to be very, very much interested in the aspect of cattle rearing and animal ranching and the impact of climate and all these other things on these issues. What do you think the government could have done better? What do you think will be your own recommendation into solving this kind of an issue?
Okay, let me just say that beyond climate change, I'm also going to speak about a few other things. First and foremost, the citizens have to hold those who they elect responsible. You know, people tend to just shout, Buhari did this, Buhari did that. You have a councillor, you have a local government chairman, and you have a governor, you have a House of Rep member, you have a senator, who all are responsible and get funds for executing community projects in those areas. How do we get people to realize that, look, the money is not just with Buhari, all these people have taken from them. I remember a few months ago when they were trying to enforce local governments getting funding directly. They used other ordinary Nigerians online to try and rubbish the project. And the whole idea was the state governors were hoarding the funds and then they dispose as they like, or they use that as power against the local governments. So the whole idea was to have, in addition to the TSA and the BVN, to have these funds go directly to the local government areas. So people have to be responsible. In the north, the Green Belt project, I don't know if you've heard of it, goes across the Sahel.
Right.
It was launched first, I think, when Obasanjo was in power. It was relaunched again. I can't remember which president it was. And guess what? Nothing was done on the ground. But funds were disbursed. You know what the locals started doing? They started afforestation drives by themselves without the government doing anything. But you don't hear a lot of that in the press because people want to say it's all so bad and so whatever. So first and foremost, everybody needs to get involved. It is not just, you know, you were speaking about the state and the government. The people in government or the state are not from Mars. They're from among Nigerians. So the people first need to realize that they play a role. You have a right to walk up to your House of Rep member, or whether, in fact, I didn't mention the state as well. You also have House of Rep members on the state level.
At the state level.
Yeah. So you need to find out who is. I raised the question. I don't know if you saw it a few days ago. I listed I think about 7 offices. Who is the officer? Who is the local government chairman? Did this for your area? Nobody could answer.
But there are primal issues.
Yeah.
There are primal issues that will not allow that to happen.
Yes.
So talking about solution, for instance,
Yeah.
how courageous is an
people.
average Nigerian to go to Honorable Waive, right? To say the good thing that he's very accessible.
Yes,
That's
I
why
can
we
tell.
actually have access to him.
Thank you.
Right?
Yeah.
He's very accessible and that's because before becoming, a House of Representative member, he ran an NGO, the Riverine, where he goes to the Riverine area. I'm sorry,
Yes.
I'm kind of putting you on the spotlight here, but he runs the Riverine areas in Delta State that people don't go to. Many times, when he comes, to visit, all those medical equipment, for instance, that, AHS, right, is not using, we take them there. He takes them to those rural areas where cars don't get there, people don't get there. So there's that direct connection and engagement with the people at the grassroots where they can talk. What has happened, is that the way the Nigerian elites, and the elites here, and I'm talking about people that have run the government in position of authority, they've created this cocoon around them that, they make themselves not to be accessible to the people. As a result, they are also not accountable to the people. So an average, I keep using the word average even though it means nothing, right? A citizen always find it very difficult to be able to challenge them. There's also another aspect of our culture that encourages that, right? We tend to rule by gerontocracy, meaning the older you are. First and foremost, if I have a very good idea to bring to you, the first question they will ask is, when were you born?
When were you born, yeah?
Right? Where were you? I think that aspect of our culture, right, needs to be revisited, that it should be about, the best ideas, right? Whoever has the best idea, let's encourage that. Let's encourage people to speak. As children, one of the things they teach us is how we survive, right, mentally. It's not critical thinking. Because as a child, when you are trying to talk, they'll say, don't you know your mates? Keep quiet. You know, you understand. There's all these little nuances. Now, I'm bringing all these little nuances. Those are the things that contribute to the system we have right now. So that thing, when you talk to an average Nigerian, says, "Oh, who am I? Who am I to say this? Who am I?" Yes, you are somebody. You know?
Right. If I may comment, so I think what we're getting at is the nature of the state in Nigeria and in Africa as a whole. It's an excruciatingly paternalistic state. It runs on a patronage system with a godfather responsible for its or his jurisdiction and the disbursement of state resources and other sort of paraphernalia therefrom. Yes, please go ahead.
Doctor, my worry is that we have changed this thing to us against them. They are in power. They are the political class.
But it's a legacy.
It's a challenge because
but it's a legacy
that's
from the colonial.
Well,
remember, so we have to correct that.
We have to change it because there are many of us who would not get involved in the process, and we allow these people to take our country. Nobody owns Nigeria more than me. That's my belief. No Nigerian owns this country more than any of us. But why are we not getting involved? That's the challenge. You look at the elite. When I talk about the elite now, I'm talking about those who are sane, who are educated, those who are patriotic. Those are the people I'm talking about when I talk about the elite now. I'm not talking about those who have had access to government coffers. Now, many of them don't want to touch it. I remember when I decided to run, I had a lot of, it's not worth it. You want to die for Nigeria? They are going to kill you. You don't have the means. You don't belong to the clique, and all those talk. And I said to them, I have, like we sing in church, this little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine. I believe that we can make a difference. So I want to make an appeal. You were talking about prosecutor and the man being prosecuted being in the same government. You see, there is no way we can completely in one day, even if we have a revolution, wipe away everybody and then bring in sense. In the beginning, both must grow together.
Right.
We must have this mix and allow more of our people to get in who believe that things can be done differently.
Right.
If I'm given the opportunity to serve in government with somebody who has been convicted, you are talking about people who were prosecuted. There's a difference. If I have the opportunity to serve with somebody who has been convicted in our system, I don't like what the person has done. The law is against it. He has destroyed our common patrimony. I'm going to take the opportunity up. One, I will use it to make a difference, to make a statement that, look, things can be done differently. You can go there and you can come out clean. I'll take that opportunity. And that's what I want our people to do. Let's get in there. Let's not keep off. Let's not be armchair critics, because this corruption thing is destroying our country.
Right.
Every problem we have, name it, insecurity, underdevelopment, lack of infrastructure, all of it comes from this matter of corruption. And we must get involved. If you are here in North America, you are a specialist, you top in your trade, somebody must die someday.
Right.
And that's what we say in the Delta. Every die na die.
Yeah.
Something must kill somebody. So
Thank you so much,
you
Honorable.
go into the system.
Yeah.
Fela told us years ago, he said, the problem is that I don't want to die, I want to build a house,
Right.
for a house. That's the problem of Nigeria.
Sorry if I may quickly comment. Somebody sent a question online, and the question is this: what are your views about the Ruga plan? Are there systems in place to make the plan work?
If I may. Now, in theory, this was a conceptually brilliant idea in terms of having fixed settlements where cattle could be raised, agro-allied industries could be set up, hides and skin, and hospitals, veterinary services, and so on and so forth. On paper, this was a very good idea. But the government blundered its way through it. First of all, you had near zero consultation. Now, you don't bring up a policy that would require every state in the country to give up portions of its land without ever telling them about it. Now, from the very name that they gave it, they began to make blunders because you're asking people to begin to read ethnic sentiments into it. If you look up the meaning of Ruga, it means a very particular thing.
Right.
And the previous name that they brought out for it also had certain ethnic connotations. Now, that doomed the program from the very beginning. But if they had started with consultations with stakeholders to say, here's what we're planning to do, these are the benefits, bring together businessmen and women, let's discuss this and so forth, that would have helped. In one of the articles that I wrote about the failure of Ruga, I cited the example of one of my former universities, University of Manitoba, where I did my master's. University of Manitoba wanted to change its logo just a few months back. They consulted thousands of people, even though the university had just about 30,000 students. So faculty, both serving and retired, current students, alumni association, the immediate community of Manitoba. So that at the end of it, the new logo of the university was a synthesis of the efforts of all of those stakeholders. Nobody could say that they were not consulted before the old 200 years plus logo was replaced. For a small logo, a tiny logo on pieces of paper. Now, the government didn't do that, and therefore they set that program on the wrong path. So that was one. And of course, besides just the lack of consultation and so forth, there was also the way that it was marketed to the country. It was not sufficient. By that, the PR and so on. Now, governance is serious socio-scientific business. It's not for jokes. It's not for people who can't, sit down and strategize and so on and so forth. I have written quite a lot about these things, that the intellectual firepower around the president and in the presidency is very weak. There does not seem to me to be any serious strategizing that's going on. And it shows in the way they blunder from one basic role of government to another. And that needs to change. Now, and as I've been saying in private conversations with friends in the last few weeks, I've gone from just criticizing to saying, I think this government needs help. Right. And that we've got to be able to step in to offer the help if they would accept that help. So there needs to be an expansion of the circle around Mr. President to ensure that new hands, fresh brains are brought in who can actually strategize and ensure that you can craft policies. And because if somebody who was from the South who were in the room when the idea of Ruga came up, they probably would have said something. That's if that person was in the room, and B, the person was sufficiently confident and secure in their position to speak. They would have said, I don't think this will fly among Southerners. But the moment you call it Ruga, you have lost the entire South. Right. They would think this is an ethnic agenda. But clearly, there wasn't a lot of consultation that went into it. And they were totally tone deaf. Thank you for that. But it's a good program. It's actually something that can work.
I think that program needs to be relaunched because that program is not new. That program is actually a solution in many jurisdictions around the world. For instance, even though it's not the same as the cattle, migration, in Canada here we have the Species, Migration Act. Right? That kind of protects. So during construction, for instance, there are some period that we cannot embark on certain kind of construction because that's the time that some of those, species, right, are kind of passing by. So it means a corridor has been assigned, right, to take care of that. You can still carry out activities within those places, but I'm not saying it's the same thing. I'm just saying the principle and the concept is the same. The problem is, like you rightly said, Dr. Oriola, is about the implementation. The culture of consultation is almost non-existent in Nigeria, where there's a top-down approach, and I think this is the part of the legacy of our military inheritance. I still question a whole lot of things that we do that we take for granted that we don't actually see as a problem. The other day, I had the opportunity of seeing, the inauguration of Mr. President, right? Buhari, and it was exercise in military, right? There's no reason why, after 60 years, right, military parade is what we herald, right? The ascension of a civilian president, right? It speaks a lot in terms of culture, and that goes into how Ruga was actually launched. That look, do as I say, obey before command, right? And all that. It's not as if that's what they plan to do,
right,
but that's the way our culture has synthesized some of these things. So the culture of engagement needs to change, but it also starts from school. Here in Canada, as you're well aware, right? For every child that will obey the traffic light, they've learned that in the kindergarten.
That's right.
And when they're driving with you behind and you cross the traffic light, they say, oh, Dad, you just, that awareness. I'm not saying that we already have wasted generation in Nigeria that'll do that, but all I'm saying is start it young, right, with them. We have to instill these values. But there's actually good news there. The good news there is that you have this generation of young people, right, in their 18, 19, 20 years old right now, that think differently. A lot of them are returnees. I just wrote, a portion of a book for a German publisher about, contemporary architecture in Nigeria, as also, architecture of northern Nigeria. And I had the opportunity of actually tracing back, some of the issues that we have. You can't divorce what's happening in Nigeria from the economic reality. How, in the 80s, how we got into structural adjustment program and the impact of structural adjustment program, creating all this insecurity. And then we have all these high fences, right, that characterize our community. Armed robbery was actually very rife. Because of armed robbery, the solution was an intellectually lazy solution, right, that was high fences. Right. Forgetting that the best form of security is when communities band together, when I'm able to see what's happening and say, oh, by the way, there's something abnormal happening in Francis.
Policing, yeah.
Community policing and all that. There are lots of experts, there are a lot of work on that, but you know what? Those may be on paper. The reality is, if I feel unsafe,
right.
I think like the other day, Dr. Oriola, we were talking about the whole perception of being safe. You can actually be in a very unsafe environment and feel very, very safe. And you can be in a very safe environment and feel very unsafe.
Yeah.
All right. All right.
And I'm like, supposing one white animal comes in.
I wanted to add that generally, I think there's a need to maximize. I think we had a national orientation agency at some point.
Yes, thank you.
The National Orientation Agency failed. Right. I would even suggest, and I've said this on the floor of the Green Chamber of the National Assembly, that the National Orientation Agency should be scrapped as it is now. Right. There's a need for that agency, but everybody there, from the top man to the lowest, have lost the vision. The drive and the passion is gone. We need that agency to rework things again for our country, to sensitize our people and all of that.
I feel it shouldn't just be in Hausa, Yoruba, or Igbo. Nigeria has so many languages. For example, I know it's a function, of course, but I feel that if we're going to have that Nigeria we all dream of, there has to be awareness, sensitization from like the nursery that you said. But what about those who don't understand English or these other three languages?
In the beginning, the National Orientation Agency was going to communities. Yeah. They had state offices, local government offices. In the beginning, they had all of that. They were going to the grassroots. So if they can go back to that, I think it will help a lot. Yeah. So we need to change what's happening in that agency.
It means you need to define what the vision of Nigeria is in a very
so that we know what we're selling.
All right. All right.
That's what the orientation agency can really build on.
So one last question here before we round it up tonight. I have a question here. It says, what are your views about accountability, transparency, and insecurity as it pertains to Nigeria? Accountability, transparency, and insecurity.
Yeah, I think all of this put together points to the absence of the rule of law. Accountability, there are rules. I can tell you that in government in our country, there are enough rules that will make people, make things work, and that will make us get value for money. The country, the government, there are enough rules. But there's the rule of law. People break the law and they go scot-free. We must get to that point where anybody who breaks the law pays for it. There's consequence for breaking the law. And that would not only have to do with criminal activity, but even with simple policy violations. When people get to know that if you break the law, you pay for it, very soon we'll see things change. And there must also be a system of rewarding those who have been good people, who have contributed to changing the narrative, who have done the right thing. The system must have a way of rewarding them. Okay. Now, we don't have that. You find somebody who has put in 35 years, retired, and another 10 years has not been paid his gratuity and pensions. Very sad. And if we can change all of this, I think we'll get there. Then, I'm also an advocate of community policing. I'm aware that community policing is not a popular idea. State police is not a popular idea in parts of the country. So what I said on the floor of the House of Representatives, is community policing within the context of the Nigerian police force as it is. In my constituency, there are about 5-6 divisional police officers, and none of them is from the area. I can also say about 70% of the policemen, they are not from the area. Now, if we ingenize in that fashion, you will find that everybody knows everybody. You know who the criminal is. That's right. And that will help we know where they keep the arms and ammunition. We know Mr. John, who was nobody yesterday, has put up something. That will come into play. And then at the national level, we can now aggregate this together and we'll have a better nation. I think these are some of the basic things I think we can do to change the narrative in our country.
But the foundation for crafting solutions has to be improving the economy and ensuring that the economy works for a majority of the people, that hard work actually pays off in the end. So as we speak, while various state governments are reluctant to pay the new 30,000 naira minimum wage, various government-related bodies and agencies are on the jamboree, all kinds of allowances, and so on and so forth. Governance is too expensive in Nigeria. It is the most expensive in the world. Actually, I don't want to pick on our guests.
Yeah, I know where you're going. You're trying to put me on the spot.
You keep that as you speak, right? In terms of like governance and all that. One of the trends I'm noticing in Nigeria right now, from an observer, right, is when you produce, you succeed, you make it. It's different from when you have 6, 7, 8 different layers of middlemen in the supply chain. So it will seem to me that money is dried up with the single treasury account or wherever. Now, when I say when you produce, you can see the reward. I'm talking about people in the Yaba, in the Silicon Valley, in Lagos. I know a few friends of mine who are architects who are actually producing, coming up with innovation. They're meeting a need, and that need, they can't even meet the supply. So maybe that conversation should be about how do you socialize people, right, to stop this mentality of wanting to be middleman. Right, that, what's my cut? What's my this, right? Yeah, because right now, those middlemen are the people suffering, and those are the people that are propagating this whole hate that, this government is terrible or whatever. But when you get to the bottom of it, they've dried up, the source of, it's so terrible that you have a contract. By the time the contractor is executing it, you have nothing. Right.
So to return to my earlier point, so the economy has to be made to work for everyone. Right. And for that to happen, basic infrastructure has to be in place so that the person who wants to start off a small business does not have to start thinking of buying a power generating set, which he or she cannot probably afford. So ensure that power is stable and all of those basic things are necessary for those kinds of initiatives to come to light. If you're going to sell just an iced block, for instance, and there's no power, you have to start getting generating sets. That already kills, any sort of passion to do that. So that's number one. Now, I always say to my students in my intro criminology classes that poverty in and of itself does not cause crime. What causes crime is inequality. Mm-hmm. The fact that some have and many don't, that's the harbinger of crime. It's not poverty. In fact, in most poor societies, I think of Cuba, for instance, where on average, Cubans cannot be described as wealthy or as rich. But the crime rate in Cuba is very low, well, because, you have basically what almost everybody else has, with very few exceptions. But when the exception becomes the rule, where most people are barely managing to get by, but they can see individuals living the good life, and they know the antecedents of these individuals. They know that this person became wealthy overnight because they had a one-year stint in government. Then you're asking them, it almost becomes a situation where they would be crazy not to join the bandwagon. Right. So, again, the state is a signifier. The Honorable was absolutely spot on earlier about the integrity and the honesty of our people. There are very few societies in the world where people are pushed to the wall as long and as intensely as our people have been pushed, and they still have peace. And in fact, the surprising thing is that there hasn't been a greater level of implosion of the system earlier than now. People are people of integrity for the most part. Most of our people are incredibly hardworking people. Right. Nigerians are the most educated people in the United States. Not the most educated immigrant group, but the most educated group, period. Our people are incredibly driven people. That's right. But we need to get it right in terms of leadership. And I hope and pray and believe very strongly with the likes of Honorable Waive that we're beginning to raise a new generation of leaders who will set things on track.
I wanted to just say something quickly. That I think in Nigeria, we have this notion that once you have graduated as an architect, you really must start looking for jobs in architecture. And if you don't get a job in architecture, that means that the economy is very bad. And you don't see yourself as, how can I go and clean the toilets? So I think we also need to, because I think so you need to find out what you can do with your hands. I have a PhD, but I am also a caterer. I'm also a music director. I consult for people with music as well. I've met Nigerians who have suggested to what trade can you learn? And they will tell me, how can I finish 4 years in university and go and learn a trade? They spoke about farming. I know many who said, how can I go and farm in my village? But at least if you get doing that, half of your problems are solved. You can feed yourself at least. And then whatever extra you get, you can do other things. So we need to change that notion that a BSc or education and getting a job are, on the same level. It doesn't always work like that. Even here in Canada.
It doesn't work like that.
Yeah, there are bus drivers who are graduates and who had to go take a driving course and then become drivers.
So I think, that's a related issue, but we could have an entire episode on that.
Yeah, some other time.
A lot of the decolonized societies, for very good reasons, in the 60s and 50s, emphasized university-level education because they needed a crop of middle-class professionals to help run the bureaucracy. Now, those jobs have since been snapped up. They're not enough. Now, the percentage of Canadians with any kind of bachelor degree of whatever hue is 28%. Only 28% of citizens in this country have a degree of any kind. In the United States, that figure is 34%, wow. A significant chunk of which is immigrants. Again, Nigerians, with the Asians coming a distant second. So our system back in the 50s and 60s emphasized university education. That was a fantastic policy at the time. But we've come to an era where we now need to emphasize trades.
Yes.
So plumbing and carpentry and things that people can do with their hands. There's a reason why most of us who have degrees, including myself, cannot do anything with our hands. I can't fix anything. I can't fix anything. So
all right.
Yeah,
I think I'm so sorry.
We have missed out totally as well. In all of this, I think wealth should not become the measure for achievement.
For success,
so we need to change that as well, because everything we've spoken about is because we see the wealthy man as the the man who has achieved all.
You know, I'm really hoping that we can do this some other time and talk and take another topic and actually examine the topic of definition of success within the Nigerian culture. Is it about how much money I have? Is it about the type of car I drive and all those types of things? Oh, how many cattle you have? Yeah. So, but I know that time wouldn't allow us to do that. So I would just want to say thank you so much to you all for being here tonight. Thank you so much, Sam. Dr. Oriola, it's so good to see you again. Dr. Ajoke and Honorable, thank you so much for honoring us with your presence. No problem. And I also want to thank my crew. Thank you so much for working with me to get this done. Dr. Alex, Chibuzo, James, and Osei, thank you so much. We hope to see you all some other time. Thanks, everybody, and have a wonderful night.